chat box is not covering the screen. You can't see my chat box covering the screen or anything, right? You just see my presentation.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll jump right in. I'm Jessica Hercules, the Community Engagement Director with the English Skills Learning Center, and we partner really closely with Catholic Community Services on a variety of projects. And one area that Ermina and I overlap on is volunteer engagement and things like that. And so happy to be here talking with you all about this topic. My background, I've been in adult education for 15 plus years. And my education background, I have a Master of Second Language Teaching. And so if I don't cover something in this presentation, I'm happy to share resources following if you have some specific questions, maybe about the folks that you're working with and things like that. But before we jump in, I want to ask you, because agency is super important in education. We're talking about two different topics today, and I want to know which you want to cover first. So the first topic that we're talking about is tips for communicating across a language barrier. So what are some considerations for communicating when the person that you're speaking with has limited proficiency in English? That's topic number one. And topic number two is teaching tips if you are specifically teaching English. So if you want to do number one first, communicating, then go ahead and put communicating in the chat. If you want to do teaching first, then go ahead and put teaching in the chat and we'll go by vote. Okay, we've got 2 to 1, 3 to 1. 3 to 2, 4 to 2. I thought maybe we'd have a wider split in voting. Yeah, and you have to communicate to teach. I think if it's okay with the crew, we're going to talk about communicating first, but I am going to tie all of these topics into the teaching when we get there. So, but we're going to start off with a little exercise here after, actually, first I'm going to introduce the ESLC a little bit. Our mission is to integrate and strengthen communities by breaking language and cultural barriers. And so participating in this workshop with us, you're helping us with our mission. And our mission, if we accomplished everything that we set out to as an organization, then we envision a community where all voices are celebrated. And that's something that I think we align closely with Catholic Community Services and why we work so well as partners in the community. And something that's really important to us is this topic of two-way mutual integration. And before I jump into that, I want to ask you all what you think that might mean. What do you think two-way mutual integration is?
How about we learn just as much about, what they need in their communication style, etc. So it's a two-way process.
Yeah, that's a great summary. So we really feel like when we have newcomers in our community, that our community is fundamentally changed and that that's a good thing, but that it requires all members of the community to learn and grow so that we can have a more welcoming place for everyone. And that's the most equitable way to integrate. So by participating in workshops like this and learning about ways to be a better communicator, be a better teacher, and learn more about the folks that you're working with, you're participating in this. And so thank you for doing that. The plan today, we're going to talk about identity and how it plays into language learning. We'll talk about some myths and misconceptions, maybe surrounding how adults and children learn. We'll highlight some common pitfalls that lead to miscommunication. And I'll give you some strategies to work around that. So we won't just talk about problems, but we'll have some solutions too. And then we'll wrap up talking about some learning activities that I hope you'll find exciting and interesting. So I want to start off with a little activity, and you don't need to put this in the chat, but I want you to think about trying to introduce yourself, only choosing one or two of these topics with a one-word answer. to describe yourself. So for example, you might say, I am Jessica and I power lift. Okay. So think about what would you say about yourself if you could just pick two. You don't need to put it in the chat. But I will ask you, do you feel like that would be a very full picture of who you are as a person if you only got to pick two things?
Heck no.
Yeah, it feels pretty limiting, right? So some considerations here for when we're working with second language learners or English language learners, we sometimes don't get the full picture, and it might take a really long time for us to really learn about the folks that we're working with when we're limited by their ability to express themselves and tell us a little bit more about themselves. We might know a lot about them, what country they come from. We might know their family members' names and some of their interests, but our identity goes a lot deeper than that. And there's so much tied into language learning and identity. They're just so closely connected. Okay, we're going to bump ahead. Another example of this, I want you to take a look at my map. This is a little Google map of things that people have asked. Why is blank state so? And then these are the most searched questions. So you can do a little thumbs up or thumbs down on screen if you see a state that is relevant to you. Either you live there now or have lived there. And does that match you? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Down, down, down.
Okay. So without, maybe you don't need to overshare things, but what's missing here? If you said thumbs down.
Well, it's painting a pretty big brush, I mean, it's very general. So it's not taken into account individual.
Yeah, so kind of related to what I mentioned previously, we might know a little bit about where someone's from, but it might not identify them correctly or might not be the full picture of who they are. And also our conceptions of that place might not be accurate in general. So some things to be thinking about also as we're getting to know newcomers. There's just so much to learn, and patience goes a long way with yourself and with the people that you're working with as you try to understand these things a little bit better. It takes time. Okay, you can give me a thumbs up instead of raise your hand if these statements are relevant to you. So, if you've learned a language, another language in a school setting.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see, thumbs up if you speak another language besides English fluently.
Nope.
Also, would challenge you to think about, what does fluently mean? Something to think about. Thumbs up if you've lived in another country besides the United States. I think we're going to start having more similar answers here. Thumbs up if your attempt at communication has ever failed miserably.
Yes.
How about if your meaning's been confused because of cultural misunderstandings?
Big time.
How about if you've tried to communicate, but you're not sure if the other person understood you at all? Or if you had no idea what the other person was trying to say and you do the smile and nod, or maybe they do that to you. Yeah, okay. I think we've all had these scenarios pop up for us, and I imagine that's in part why you're here in this training this evening. So I'm hoping that we can shine a light on some of the areas where these miscommunications happen frequently, and then offer some solutions that you can implement pretty quickly and see a difference in your ability to communicate. So let's jump right in. But I want to ask you, what are some factors that have contributed to failed communication for you? And you can unmute and answer that question. We're a fairly small group.
I think where the
Having a different sorry, go ahead, Carol.
No, I was just saying, I think where the translator app has heard the words differently, and I have to make sure that I read in English after I say it to see if it's even in English saying what I said.
Oh, so using translation devices or even interpreters that it might be kind of working through another party can lead to some miscommunication. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit. What else?
I found that sometimes words have different meanings to different people. And so I can use a word, but it means something completely different to me.
Right.
Yeah. We've been thinking about that a lot as an organization as we talk about the word integration. And for some people, that word integration just is kind of loaded and carries a lot of different concepts with it. And for others, it might not carry that same weight. There are lots of examples of words like that. But yeah, good example. What else might lead to miscommunication?
Sometimes there's no translation for certain words. Like if you say a word and there like is no analog in a different language for that word, they're never going to understand you.
Yeah. And a lot of that is tied to culture too, right? Mm-hmm.
So that's another one. I think just if you know the culture of the other person, then you can communicate with them better. If they know your culture, they can communicate with you, because some things, so many things are culture based.
Yeah, concepts around lots of things like time, like what time you come to something. You might say come at 5 o'clock, and that means something really different for people depending on
Different
where,
cultures.
what, yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other examples?
Environmental noise always plays a factor for what I'm trying to do with public transportation orientation. And you're on the road trying to talk in the app and have it speak loudly enough back so it's heard.
Yeah. Yeah, great examples. We'll highlight a couple more of these, but I want to talk about different ways that we communicate. So beyond just the words that we use and the like vocabulary, we use body language, we use tone, stress, the way we pause, the volume at which we speak, or the way that we change volume in a sentence. And these are not all universal, right? Different languages and different cultural communities use these in different ways. So an example of this from my own experience, when I first started teaching in Salt Lake, I had a class where a lot of the adults in the class were from Somalia, and the rules around communication are very different than what I was accustomed to. And so what I perceived in the class was women were talking over each other and yelling at each other. And really, that was just, they were just having a conversation. So I asked them, like, is everybody okay? Is everyone happy right now? And they're like, yeah, we're fine, lady. Why are you, why are you all concerned? But just the rules around turn taking, stress, and volume were different than what I was accustomed to. And so I was misunderstanding the whole tone of the conversation. I'm going to put this quote up here as we're talking about culture that I think is really important. And this is a really wonderful, beautiful book, by the way. If you're open to book recommendations, this is, it's kind of like a textbook. It's a little bit like homework asking you to read this book. But if you like reading things like that, I would strongly suggest it. This says that culture is the way that every brain makes sense of the world. That's why everyone, regardless of race or ethnicity, has a culture. And think of culture as a software for the brain's hardware. The brain uses cultural information to turn everyday happenings into meaningful events. So we don't understand anything without understanding it through the lens of our own culture. And as we learn about other cultures, right, then that might expand a little bit. We might be able to understand things a little bit differently, but everything that we see and that we process, we do so through the lens of our own cultures, whether we realize it or not. And I'm going to show you some examples of this with Zaretta Hammond's culture tree. And she's borrowed this from someone else, but when we talk about culture, we might understand it to mean a variety of things, but most often we might think of the surface culture items. And those are the things that are listed in the leaves of the tree here. So food, games played, clothing, maybe hairstyles, the things that are really easily observable. If you kind of breach one of these topics, it has a pretty low impact on emotional trust because it's kind of superficial. But as we get deeper into the roots of the tree, this is where big miscommunication can happen and people might start feeling offended or hurt by things that you say or rules that you break that maybe you didn't even know about. So those shallow culture things are maybe unspoken rules, but the members of the community understand them well, like concepts of time. What does being honest mean? What are some nonverbal communication cues? What does it mean if I nod my head this way or if I do this instead? What does work look like? So these do have a higher emotional impact on trust. They might still be observable, but they're not easy to see. And then a layer down below that, we start talking about deep culture. And these are concepts around relationships, decision-making, spirituality, origins of life, things like that, that people might not even realize are unique to their culture or community until we really examine those things or until there is a breach of trust on that level. They feel deeply wounding and maybe feel deeply othering when you learn that someone doesn't share those same values with you. So thinking about culture, it's not just those observable things, but there's so much to learn about a person's culture, and all of this plays into language learning too and communication. So I wanted to dive into that a little bit before we talk about other more like verbal things with communication, but just recognizing that sometimes if something that you're communicating doesn't land well or isn't well received, it may not be the words that you choose. It may be something surrounding these shallow or deeper culture concepts, and it takes a while to learn about that and to understand that that's what's going on. So I'd encourage you as you're learning about the folks that you're working with, see what you can do to learn more about these shallow culture things and ask questions surrounding those, because people do like talking about that. And they may just not realize that there might be some big differences across communities. Okay, we're going to go back to a thumbs up, thumbs down activity here with adult language learning myths and tips. And I promise I'm not trying to trick you. Maybe a little bit. We'll see. My first statement here for true false is that young children are better learners than adults. Okay, Heidi, I think you're the only thumbs down that I see. I don't think I have everyone on the screen, but I would love to hear why you said thumbs down.
Because young children are really good learners. They are. But one thing that we forget is that young children are learning like it's all they do. You know, they learn, they're focused on it all the time. They don't hold down a job. They don't have to pay the bills. They don't need to worry about, getting food on the table, hopefully, that kind of thing. And I think learning, in my experience, it's about work. And so when you have an adult who can put in the amount of work and the amount of time a child can put in, I think the adult can learn. The
Hmm.
brain is still capable, has been my experience.
Okay. And Tani, I saw you put a, oh, sorry, Janet, go ahead, and then I'll jump over to Tani.
Sorry. I was just gonna say, I'm thinking of cognitive capacity, like, um, a 5-year-old doesn't have the capacity to even verbalize, certain concepts and things like that. So I'm gonna say adults are better.
Okay.
And I don't
Yeah,
like
so
I like
talking
it.
about talking about Heidi's example of like holding down a job and paying bills and things, could a child learn those skills?
They're pretty complex.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Tani? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I recently read an article and it said that, the older you get, a lot of things are harder to learn, but learning another language, the older you get, it can actually be easier because you have a higher vocabulary. You've been introduced to more words over your life. And so I was even recently encouraging my mom, hey, we've been doing Duolingo for almost a year. You should do it too and try it out. And it's a lot of fun. And so it made me a little more willing to try it out after I had read, hey, this is something that adults and even people that are getting a little bit older can have a little bit easier time learning. Of course, it's always ideal to be immersed in the language and stuff like that, but we can each try and do our part to learn a little more.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I for this one, I only called on the people that agreed with me. I promise I'll let the ones that don't agree with me talk in future ones, but I won't say that this is false and I won't say that it's true because I think really that it's not necessarily true, that children and adults learn very differently from each other. And we certainly see that, like, especially when we're talking about language learning, kids learn the language so quickly. And there are a lot of reasons for that. They're less inhibited in trying something new. They're more apt to play than adults. And play and lower inhibitions are really important for language learning. But in other ways, as you mentioned, cognitive abilities and also just metacognitive skills, knowing what it takes to learn something and being intentional about that is something that adults are better at than children. So it's not necessarily true, not necessarily false. So I told you, I'm not trying to trick you, but I do want to be thinking about these things from a couple different perspectives.
It's really interesting. So I know American Sign Language, and I've been teaching my kids that. And my teacher had told me that children pick that up faster than regular language. They are picking it up so fast. And I'm like, wow. And I think it's because they're learning just a word like cat, dog, that's not very complex. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and usually the words that they're learning are tied to their needs. So I'm thinking about when I taught my young kids basic, kind of baby sign language that was like milk, more, don't want, nap time, things like that were just part of our every day, and they learn them pretty quickly. So I think that's true, and I think that's actually something that's shared across kids and adults, that we all learn better when what we're learning is relevant to our everyday needs and goals. I'm going to jump to the next one here. Next statement, you can do thumbs up or thumbs down. The more time a language learner spends soaking up English, I'm going to put that in little quotesies, soaking up English, the more quickly they'll learn the language. Zach, you looked like reluctant to put the thumbs up. Do you feel like I'm going to trick you?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I feel like being surrounded by like language you don't understand obviously like makes a huge difference and can really help you learn a language. But if you're, completely immersed and you don't know what's going on, I feel like a sense of like isolation and panic could set in. Like I think that's how I would feel if I was
Okay.
immersed in, English, knowing zero English. So I think, to an extent it's probably true, but the way that you're dealing with it also matters a lot, and the support you have as well.
Yeah, so you're bringing up some really good points, and I want to highlight this word soaking up because that's kind of my trick word here, because soaking up is passive, right? But language learning is not passive. So just because you are immersed or surrounded by the language doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to learn faster if the level of language around you is not appropriate for where you are. So there's a concept in language learning that says that your interlanguage, or the language capacity that you have in the target language, whether that's, if we're talking about Spanish, whether you can get through a city or get through the airport, or you just can order from a menu, that would be your interlanguage, kind of the skills that you have. The language that you're going to learn can only be one little step above that interlanguage, or else learning is not going to happen. So imagine you learn tomorrow that you are moving to Cambodia, and the folks that know you're moving are like, all you got to do is listen to the radio and you're going to learn it in no time. Do you feel confident in your ability to learn the language because you're going to listen to the radio and watch TV? I don't think so. But if you do have an interest, say you're interested in basketball or you're interested in photography or something, and you find a podcast that's in the language that's something that you're interested in, and you already have some foundation in that topic, then learning is going to happen a lot easier for you because it's relevant to you, and the level would be a little bit more appropriate and accessible to you. So there are a lot of factors there, not just being exposed to the language, but learning is an active process. And I want to check here with your chat, Heidi. If you're using the language, you're learning enough to begin thinking in that language, and it helps so much. Yeah, and I would add being able to joke in a language is like really good sign that you're on your way. Yeah, and how do you find the interest of the person that you're teaching when you don't share a language? Great question, and we'll get to some of that in a little bit. Okay, next one. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. I'm just going to tell you right here that this is false. A person's cultural background has no effect on how long it takes, since everyone learns language the same way. I think that we know that this is not true, right? We all learn in different ways and at different paces, and that our cultural background and how close it is to the target language makes a huge difference in how easy it is to learn a language, right? If let's say you're an English speaker and you're moving to Germany, you're probably going to learn the language a little bit faster than if you're doing my previous example of moving to Cambodia, right? Just because there's more similarities across cultures, there's more similarities in the language, and those will have an effect in your ability to learn the language faster or slower. Okay. A person affected by trauma may have trouble managing time, paying attention during class or in meetings, and or remembering things. You see a thumbs up or a thumbs down for this
Definitely.
one. Yeah, you're totally right. So I bring this up in part because just remembering to give folks grace, whether that's yourself or the people that you're working with or both, that trauma you've experienced can affect your ability to manage time, can affect your attentiveness, and your ability to remember things short and long term. Sometimes this might look like a lack of engagement, especially if you're in a tutoring setting. And I would encourage you to not think of what looks like disengagement to be a lack of interest or lack of care, that it may be that in that moment, their mind is somewhere else, and it has nothing to do with what you're doing in the moment. It may be that they're experiencing something again that happened in their past, and to give people a little bit of space and time. I wish that I had time to go over a lot more about how trauma can affect learning with you all. The SLZ has a 6-hour workshop about this, and that's not even enough time. But the next time we do one of those workshops, I will send it to Ermina to share it with you all if you're interested in learning more about topics like that. Have a couple more here. That trauma can also affect a person's ability to form trusting relationships, and that's going to come into play a lot as you're mentoring or tutoring, and especially if you have what's perceived as an authority role. So if you are in a teacher role or something like that, it may take a little bit longer for someone to form a trusting relationship with you, depending on their past experience. And again, urge you to not take that personally, but just recognize that that is kind of a defense mechanism that some people might have developed to keep themselves safe. And my last one here. Oh, no, that was it. I condensed them. I forgot. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. And I'm going to share with you two scenarios that I want you to imagine in your mind. And you can close your eyes if you want to. You can keep it open. It's up to you. The first one is the police officer held out his hand and stopped the car. Okay, so we're imagining that scenario unfolding. The second scenario is Superman held out his hand and stopped the car. Some of you are laughing. Did those happen very differently in your mind? And if so, then how are they different?
Back to the authority figure. You would think Superman, hey, Superman, and cop, ah.
Yeah, so maybe just a reaction to the different people. What else might be different?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking of, how, no, it's going to get political, about killings and things like that. But anyway, so yeah, if you're a certain race, you might, be more worried about a policeman than Superman for sure.
Yep.
I was thinking something along the lines of if the policeman holds out his hand, the car will see the policeman holding out his hand and stop the car, whereas I'm imagining Superman physically stopping the car with his super strength.
Yeah, like with Superman, maybe the front end of the car is like
Right,
crunched in, right? Yeah, so why do we think of these things as so different? And why might someone else not think of these two as being so different?
It's all in our biases and our experiences, our life.
Yeah. If you've never heard of Superman, then that's the difference is not going to really mean anything to you. Yeah. So our cultural background knowledge plays a huge role in our ability to understand things. So I'm going to talk about some other culturally related language and why it's confusing for English language learners and some ways that we can kind of work around that.
Our personal experience, not cultural experience, but our personal experience really affects the way we react to different experiences in our life, or things like a policeman for me is anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
That's because I've been stopped so much.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. With my personal experience, my brother is a police officer, and his job, he is a sergeant, and he's a community engagement. It's funny that we have the same title in very different areas. And he's asked if he can come visit and give information about safe driving in some of our classes. And I've told him, yeah, you can come, and I want you to wear street clothes. And he's like, but I want them to know I'm a police officer. It's like, and I want you to wear street clothes. And just because, we have different personal experiences with authority. Okay. I would love for someone to read this aloud. You can just unmute and go for it. Anyone that would like to read it aloud.
Well, I will, because I don't think you're going to. Kara Hai Chuk Wu Trong Hong Noi Kak.
I think probably you did a great job, and I don't think anyone on this call can tell if you did or did not do a great job. But I will ask, what would Janet need to know to be able to read this?
Which language it is?
That's a good start. Yeah.
What sounds the vowels make in that language,
Yeah.
what sounds the consonants make, what sounds the letter combinations make, what do all of those little symbols mean as far
Yeah.
as like stressing, are some of these sounds guttural, or you know, like there's a lot.
Yeah. Look at, I mean,
Yeah.
I've never seen that one, the double thing over the U. I've never seen that before.
Yeah. What else might she need to know to be able to read this?
How to read.
Yeah. Just basic decoding skills, right? To be able to look at that and know what each symbol that each symbol has meaning and know which direction to start, for example. Yeah. Anything else? What about the actual words? So I don't mean just be able to read it aloud, but to be able to understand it. Yeah, vocabulary, maybe some context would be important too. I've got another example here for you. Name 2 cabinet level positions. Can anybody do that?
A high cabinet and a low cabinet.
Yeah, we got uppers and lowers.
Which
Does anyone
kind of,
have a different understanding of this?
When I
Oh.
think of it, I think of like the governor's cabinet or the president's or, so I'm thinking chief of staff and, things like that.
Yeah, Secretary of State,
Yeah.
Secretary of
Capital.
Treasury.
yeah,
Yeah.
they are capital.
Yeah. So what would you need to know to understand that this is a question from the citizenship exam?
You'd have to know that there are people in our government that we refer to as cabinet level, but we're not talking about the kitchen right now.
Right. Mhm.
You'd have to know the context.
Yeah, you need a lot of context here. Mhm. Okay. So there are a lot of things that come into language learning, right? It's not just about the words and it's not just about the letters and the sounds, but there's so much more to it. Sorry, we're not taking a break. We're just rolling right through. I'm going to do a dramatic reading for you. Actually, Heidi, since you're unmuted, will you do a dramatic reading for us? As I click through, I'll ask you to put stress on the orange letter on the screen.
I never said she stole my money. 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 I never said she stole my money.
Okay, and with each of those, we understand them to mean something different, right? And why is that? How did we all know that each time she read it, there's a different meaning that we should understand?
Well, if I'm accenting she, then I'm saying, well, I didn't say she did it, but obviously someone did steal my money. You know, if I'm accenting said, it's like, well, I never said that, but maybe I, inferred that, or
Mhm.
someone else said that. If I accent the I, like the accent's
Yeah.
on the one that is, that's not how it is.
So in English, stress on a word really changes the sentence. And similarly, we double up words sometimes to mean something different. So I might say, like, I never said she stole my money. Like, And that means she didn't like really steal it, like she borrowed it and then she never gave it back or whatever. That is not a universal language thing. And so if you tried to do that same thing in a language that you're learning, people might be like not understanding what you're trying to say if you try to use that same pattern or the same rules for communicating. Oh, and to answer your question, Carol, we were planning on going until 7:30. But if you have to hop off early, I know that Ermina is recording this. Okay. Okay, so we talked about problems. I want to talk about solutions. And this might not sound like a solution, but I would encourage you to avoid translation devices when you can. There are some examples here about why. I think some of these are very cute, like the tiny grass is dreaming is my favorite. But as I'm sure you've all experienced, the translation devices don't get it right some of the time. And they've gotten a lot better in the last 5 or 6 years, like a lot better. But there's still some areas where it's not helpful. And something else that I would add is once you get into using translation devices, then you will never be able to step away from it because it's just too easy of a tool. And so that friction that needs to happen for language learning to happen, you don't get to have that friction and that experience of trying a new word or something like that. So where possible, I would encourage you not to use translation devices. So what to do instead? Use Google Photos. So I think Heidi, was it you that was asking about learning about interests? You might use Google Photos as a way to talk about interests, things that you like, or pictures of you doing things that you like, and see if that sparks something, the people that you're working with. Pantomiming and gestures are not universal, but it's a good start. And sometimes there are things that can't be misinterpreted with pantomime and gestures. And then, of course, where you can use real life items. So the example on the page here, if you're talking about clothing, bring out the actual piece of clothing and give it a name and like let people hold it and touch it and repeat it. So using the real items is really important. Okay. Another tip here, avoid speaking at your normal pace because we can't listen faster, right? Although I think we get pretty good at it if you listen to your podcasts at like 1.5 speed. I'm at that point now. So instead of speaking at your normal pace, pause. Pause between words, pause between ideas, simplify your language where you can, and speak more slowly, not louder. Louder doesn't help unless there's some kind of environmental interference that Carol was talking about previously. And something else that I think is really hard for us to do, especially in United States culture, is to give people time for a response and be okay with it being quiet. We're so uncomfortable with quiet. And by jumping in and filling in the gaps where there's silence, we might be taking away someone's opportunity to respond when they just finally got up the courage to say the thing that they're trying to say. So I would encourage you to think about waiting 10 seconds after you ask a question. 10 seconds is a long time. But if you think about how long it takes for you to kind of interpret the question, process it in your mind, come up with a translation for that, double check it again, because you're an adult and you don't want to make a mistake, and then finally say the thing that you're trying to say. 10 seconds can go by pretty quickly. So wait, even before you rephrase, and even consider if you are going to repeat, say the same thing again rather than rephrase. And we'll get to that in a minute. But sometimes when you rephrase, now you have 2 tasks in front of the person where previously they just had 1. So rephrasing immediately, unless you know that you totally just said it wrong, don't rephrase immediately. This is tricky to do in English, isn't it? Avoid tag questions. How do you answer one of these questions? Because they're not actually questions, they're statements, but they're disguised as a question. So I'm saying something that I want to confirm, and then I'll ask a question in the same sentence to confirm what I just said. English is so weird that we do this. So I would say, you went to the store, didn't you? And how do they answer that question? Yes, I did. But there's didn't in the question. And so it's really confusing. So instead of tag questions, and you're gonna be like, your antennae are gonna be up for tag questions now in your future conversations, I hope. And you'll realize how often we use tag questions to make it so the other person doesn't have to answer our question. We just want to answer our own questions. So instead, ask a direct question that can be answered with yes or no, or maybe either or. So instead of you went to school today, didn't you? The question can be, did you go to school today? And then that person can actually respond to that. And it's really easy to know how to answer that question.
How about contractions? Are those confusing?
It depends.
Okay.
But I wouldn't avoid using contractions because they're such a part of everyday English. I mean, even in our English classes, we teach explicitly, I'm gonna, she's gonna, because no one says going to. Although I did have a volunteer come through training who's really mad about us teaching improper English. Like, that's not improper English. That is everyday English.
Okay.
I'm gonna. She assured me she does not speak that way. It's like, okay, well, you're the one. You're the only one.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So if you are talking with someone who is a brand new English language learner, I might separate those contractions. But there are some things that it's just such a part of everyday English that it's not really helpful to try to avoid those. Here's another challenge, and I always get super like tuned in to my filler words, and I just used another one with so well, like, and basically, and does that make sense? Things like that. And the reason that we should avoid these is because when someone's learning a new language, they assume that everything that you're saying carries meaning. And there's another one. An example of this, I speak French, and I was speaking with another French speaker who's from the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. And she kept saying this word bleh. And I was like, I'm not familiar with that word. So I asked another person, is she incorporating other languages that she knows into what she's saying to me? Because I don't know what bleh means. What does bleh mean? And the person that I asked laughed at me so hard. And she said, it's just a filler word. It's like. And I spent so much time trying to figure out, what does bleh mean? And bleh doesn't mean anything. It means I'm thinking, I'm pausing. I don't have my idea fully formed yet. So just an example that those little filler words, people are going to assume that they carry meaning when they don't. And it's really hard to eliminate those, but something to think about. Okay. Idioms. Are we on the same page? I like my joke about, this joke was funnier 5 years ago than it is now, to avoid idioms like the plague. But you will be surprised at how many idioms we use in English, especially sports metaphors and like war-related metaphors. We use them all the time, like hit it out of the park, taking my marching orders, taking one for the team. Those are things that we say, and they don't actually mean anything to somebody who doesn't know their origins or doesn't know the context in which those things are used, and might, if you're using a translation device and you say, hit it out of the park, it's going to translate those individual words. It's not going to translate the concept. So if you can eliminate idioms and speak as literally as possible, then that's going to eliminate a lot of confusion.
I used one yesterday. I was playing, I'm a youth mentor, and I was doing some Legos with the kids, and we were talking while we are doing it. And one of the girls was doing it really fast. And I said, she is going to town. And they looked at me like, no, she's not. They're like,
She's staying right here.
Yeah, what?
Yeah, great example. So as you start talking and thinking about use of idioms, you're going to notice how often those creep into our language. So it can be a challenge, but think about, can you be as literal as possible? Here are some fun idioms in other languages that are like, what, how could that possibly mean that? But as you start to think about idioms we use in English, like going to town, why does that mean that you're doing something with like so rapidly? Like, why does it mean that? I don't know. But I like these examples. Okay, there are lots of other colloquialisms that we use. Can you think of any other examples? I can give you a Utah specific one. What is the word used by Utahns when you don't go to class? You skip class and you go to 7-Eleven or something.
Fluff.
Bluff.
Slough. That is not what that means to the rest of the United States.
It's fluff? Did you say fluff?
Slough.
Oh, slough. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But there are other colloquialisms or kind of everyday language things. This is apparent to me. The last couple days I've been picking up my 11-year-old nephew from summer camp, and some of the words that he used, I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't know if the thing that you're talking about, if you're saying positive or negative things about it, because I don't understand half the words that you're saying, because I'm old now.
My stepmom is Japanese, and my brother said to her, I'm going to go crash. And she was like, what?
That's a great example.
Grabbed his car keys out of his hand.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead here and talk about one of the last points, which is phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs is when we take a verb and we have a preposition and we smash them together, and they don't mean what either the first or second word, like they don't have anything to do with each other. So end and up, like we know what end up means, right, as English language users, but it doesn't have anything to do with end, and it doesn't have anything to do with up. We put them together and it changes their meaning completely. Get away, hold on, break down. These are all examples of this. So to illustrate this, I want to ask you about take off. What can it mean? Take off. And you can shout them out.
Oops, leave.
Yeah, leave. Like, I'm going to take off. I'm done.
Fly away in an airplane.
Sure.
Drive away.
Drive away. Mm-hmm. What else?
Take off your clothes.
Mm-hmm. Like remove a clothing item. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just going to buzz through these. Airplane going up. It can also mean that you increased in success or popularity, right? Her career took off. And it kind of means the same thing with an airplane going up, but it's not really. It can mean to remove something. It can mean to leave. It can also mean to not work for a period of time. So I'm going to take off the next 2 weeks. Means I'm on vacation. I'm not working, right? So thinking about those things, what can we say instead of, I ran into him yesterday. This is an example of our phrasal verbs. What might we be able to say? I saw him yesterday.
Or met him.
Sure. And be a little bit more literal. This is some killer soup.
It's really good.
Yeah. Did someone drop you off?
Hmm.
Did someone bring you?
Did that
Great.
bring- Okay, yeah.
Or maybe, did you come on the bus or did you walk, right? You can do an either or question. Has the rain let up?
Stop.
So, yeah, I think we get the point. And with this one, great job. I would just say, leave it at great job.
Mm.
Do you two get along?
Mm.
Are you friends? Yeah. Okay. So I mentioned this previously, but when you ask a question or when you say a statement, avoid rephrasing immediately because you've taken what was once one task and turned it into two tasks. So use that wait time to your advantage. Maybe you did ask the question or said your statement and it was poorly phrased. Go ahead and rephrase it in that case if you are trying to correct yourself. But if you put yourself in the place of the English language learner, if you've learned another language, sometimes you just need people to say it again. The same thing, say the same thing again and give me another shot. Give me a shot. That's a colloquialism, right? An idiom. Okay, I'm going to skip this so that we can jump into some teaching activities for our last 30 minutes. But in other words, here are kind of the takeaway points. And if you want to screenshot this or something, take a photo of it. This is kind of the rundown of the things that we've talked about. But use wait time, restate, don't rephrase, at least not right away. Ask questions with intent and be as literal as possible. Speak slowly. Volume is not going to help you when that's not the problem. Practice what you're going to say before. So be intentional with what you're going to say and know ahead of time what you're going to say. Be okay with silence. It's not that weird. It's not that awkward and you get used to it. And of course, be patient with yourself and with the language learners that you're working with. Okay. I just crammed more than 90 minutes of content into an hour and I've got more to go. So I want to talk with you about some teaching strategies. And I want to start off with talking about literate learners versus non-literate learners and the way that they learn. And I hate putting this much text on a screen. It goes against everything that I know. So I've broken this down for you. So don't feel like you need to dive into this right now. So non-literate learners, folks who have not learned to read or write in any language, including their primary language or their home language, might be better at learning from watching and doing. So what that means for class time is that you might need to explicitly model what it is that you want people to do for the activity that you have for them. They tend to be orally, so like hearing oriented. And these are not absolute statements, and it doesn't mean that literate learners don't do this. And when we talk about what literate learners, the way that they learn, it doesn't mean that that excludes non-literate learners. We're talking in generality here. But for folks that tend to be orally oriented, keep your instructions concise and repeat them often. Non-literate learners often repeat to remember. So give them opportunities to repeat something several times so that they can commit it to memory. We're talking about neuroplasticity. The more times and the more opportunities that we have to do something and to practice something, the more permanent it becomes in our brain and the more connections that we make to that from the other things that we learn. So you've probably heard practice makes perfect, and I don't think that that's really true. Practice makes permanent. So whatever it is that you're practicing, it's going to become more permanent, not necessarily perfect. Okay, so it's next. Non-literate learners might have had limited time for learning to read, right? They haven't spent all their lives learning how to read, so using that skill for language learning is not going to be an asset for them. So instead, if you're giving instructions, spend time explicitly learning those decoding skills and talking about sounds one at a time. Because those things that we do when we're kids as we're learning to read, if they haven't had that opportunity, even as they become teenagers and adults, they still need to start there with learning to read. We're not going to start with whole word. Because learning to assign sounds to symbols is a skill, and it's not something that, you know, we learned it pretty explicitly as we've learned to read, and that same process has to happen for people at any stage of life if they're learning to read for the first time.
I have a question. So, would a person need to learn how to speak the language before they could read it?
No.
Okay.
No. And an example of that, I do not speak German, but I can phonetically read German, at least phonetically, because I know what the sounds are. I've learned that piece, but I don't speak German. I don't understand anything that I'm reading. So it can go one way or another, but they really, what should happen is kind of bridging those skills together at the same time, if it's possible.
Thank you.
So non-literate learners might lack confidence in their ability to learn. They might feel frustrated and get discouraged easily. And so as mentors and tutors, they need regular opportunities to be successful. And that might mean bringing back things that they've already learned several times as a way to remind them, like, yes, you have learned things, and reviewing things is important. And we'll talk a little bit about routines, but routines in your practice will help build confidence for learners. And that's not only true for non-literate learners, right? That's true for all of us. And this is also true for everyone, that we all learn best when content is relevant to everyday lives, but it's especially true for non-literate learners. So making connections to their daily activities is really important. So if you're practicing phonics, for example, if you don't make it clear the purpose of doing that, or if you don't connect it to why it's important to be able to do this, then it's not it might not really take hold in their mind as it would if they really understand the importance of it and that they can be successful in that. And then this non-literate learners may accept all information as being equally important. And I reference this a little bit in filler words when we're using filler words with like. When you are new at learning something, you don't necessarily have the skills immediately to be able to tell what's important and what's not important, and to be able to disregard things that that they should be disregarding and hold on to the things that they should be paying attention to. So if you're working on worksheets, they need to be really clear. Instructions need to be really concise, and they should stay with whatever the objectives are in learning. So if you're talking about fruits and vegetables and you have some worksheet that talks about some fruits and vegetables, but it includes ones that you haven't talked about, eliminate those for now, right? Even if they're all kind of on the same topic, because if it's extraneous or if it's not something that they need to know, that's what's going to catch their attention. If you think about when you're in school asking your teacher, is this going to be on the test? And they're like, no, it's not going to be on the test. Like, well, then why are we talking about it? Okay, so some potential pitfalls here for non-literate learners. If you're practicing phonics and then you start talking about what the words mean, that can be really confusing, and you're kind of mixing the purpose of what you're doing. So if you're practicing phonics, stay with practicing phonics. You don't need to say, oh, we're talking about there, but there's actually there and there and there, and they all mean different things. And there's no need to get into that, right? Keep whatever your purpose was for what you're talking about, stay with that purpose. Wordy worksheets, they got to go. And if that means that you have to kind of create a new worksheet from an existing one and simplify it, it will be well worth your time. if it's at a more appropriate level for the person that you're working with. If any of you are working with adults, I would encourage you not to take children's materials, even if it is on level for them. Don't use children's materials. Make it again, because children's materials have teddy bears and caterpillars, and an adult is immediately going to look at that and be, number one, discouraged and offended. And also, it's not relevant to their everyday life. That's not going to keep their attention. So if you want to do a phonics worksheet, take one that has adult topics in there. A good resource if you're working with adults who are not literate in any language is ABC English. ABC English was created by Utah and one of my colleagues that I respect a lot. And she has some free things on the website, and there's some things behind a paywall, but it's really good stuff. My third point here, if you jump into an activity without modeling it first, without showing them how to do it, it will feel really frustrating. And those little points of success are so important for learners that you can't skip it. So don't skip modeling how to do an activity before you ask someone to jump in and do it. I don't know if you can hear the piano. I don't know why every time I'm on a Zoom call, my son wants to practice piano, and he never wants to practice piano any other time. This can be really tricky, this next point, but try not to move on without checking comprehension. Make sure that people are demonstrating that they can do the thing that you've practiced. So asking, do you understand? Do you have any questions? That is not sufficient, right? Have them show you, find ways for them to show you that they can do what it is that you've been practicing. That might mean that you say, okay, I want you to go in the other room and call me, and we're going to do this conversation again, but we're going to do it over the phone. Or that might mean, now we're going to go to the grocery store and you're going to be the one that goes through and talks to the cashier, or whatever it looks like, right? But finding ways to check comprehension and ask them to show that they can do the thing that they're hoping to be able to do with the language. And then another thing for, especially with non-literate learners, if you write the word that you're talking about before you've orally practiced, then again, it's two tasks in one, right? Because they're not going to be listening to the word that you said. They're going to be looking at what's on the board or what's on the paper in front of them, and they're going to try to draw it too, but they're going to try to, and I say draw because non-literate learners are not necessarily writing, right? They're approximating the shapes that are up on the board. So if you want to practice writing letters, then stick with practice writing letters. And if you want to orally practice words, then stick with orally practicing words before you start mixing those skills together. But I would always start with listening and speaking first before you get into reading and writing. Okay. Any questions before we jump into the next topic? Oh, Heidi, you've got a question for doing these things, teaching online. That's a great question. My biggest tip is finding ways to flip things so that the people in your Zoom room are the ones doing the talking. I'm not doing a great job of doing that tonight because there's so much content that I'm trying to cover. If I had as much time with you as I wanted, I would have you be doing a lot more of the talking. So whatever way you can kind of take away you from speaking, you might send them reading, separate from the Zoom, and you might both be referencing that reading passage and then ask them questions from it, things like that. So yeah, but if you have specific questions, we can chat about it, or you can send me an email after this training if you'd like to.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So this is my first time being with you, and I love it. Thank you so much. And I'm working with an Afghani family, and the girls quit school in the 6th grade, so they're so far behind. And the
Mhm.
parents, that's one of their big goals, is to learn English. And so I'm kind of like, where do I start? Like, what, is there,
Mhm.
so for you, like when you do these teachings, do you do on different topics? Is there a book I could read? What can I do?
Yeah, there are a lot of resources online. There are some like tutoring kits that you can download from different websites that I can share with you. And I think Armina has some of those already.
Oh, awesome.
But yeah, there are things that you can do. I think the number one thing that you can do, especially for like 15, 16-year-old kids, is get them into friend groups with kids who have already learned a little bit of English but share the same language as them. And they will start learning really fast.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to jump forward a little bit. Creating a routine in your skills practice is really important. So if every time you meet, you practice the calendar, then you practice the alphabet, then you practice some phonics and numeracy, those kinds of things. Like do that every time. Keep that routine going because people need to feel successful, right? And also there's a concept called task awareness. So task awareness means knowing how to do the thing that you need to do, like whatever the activity is for learning to happen. And if every time someone's learning, they're having to learn a new activity and now the new content that goes along with it, that's too much at one time. So especially for someone who might have limited or interrupted education, some of those classroom type activities that we're used to, that might be a new skill that they're practicing, and that might not be totally intuitive. So be thinking about, I want to practice these skills so that when I want to plug new vocabulary into the same activity, I don't have to explain the activity too. I just have to give them the new vocabulary to put into this activity that's already really comfortable for them. So for example, if you use fill in the blank worksheets, continue using fill in the blank worksheets as you bring in new vocabulary, because if they know how to do that type of activity, what to do with a fill in the blank worksheet, then all they have to do is learn the content and not just the activity and the content together. That's too much. Creating routines and continuing with them build confidence and comfort. Some things that you can do is connecting. If you're doing general literacy skills and phonics, then find ways to then connect that with some of the vocabulary that you're practicing, if you can do that. So maybe not in the same lesson, but maybe in the same evening that you'll spend the first part of the night with phonics, and then you might bring some of that phonics practice in to work on the new vocabulary or sentence building that you're working on. Word sorts are really a great way to practice phonics. So you might find items that start with, maybe choose 3 different letters that you're going to work on. And we're finding items that start with and with, and you've got a bunch of them on the table, maybe just pictures of them, or maybe you have the real things. And you're going to say, this is a pen. Where does it go? With or, and have them sort those by sound. Can be a really great activity that you can do with stuff that's just in the house. Okay. And I mentioned this a little bit, but learning strategies. So it may not be that the people that you're working with already know how to do these classroom type activities. So you may need to take a step back from the language and teach the learning strategies as well. So this might be that every time you're doing a worksheet, you're reminding them to write their name and the date at the top of it. Because when they go to school in the fall, they're going to have to do that. Maybe not, maybe if they're using computers, I don't know. I had young people putting together some student kits and they didn't know how to open a 3-ring binder. And I was like, they don't use them. Why would they know how to do this? I totally forgot. Had to show them how to open the 3-ring binder. But work on test taking strategies. So if you know that they're going to be taking some tests, spend time talking about multiple choice tests and talking about the fact that there is only one right answer, and that in order for that answer to be correct, it has to be 100% correct without any errors. So even if it's mostly correct, that's not going to be the right choice. And those are things that you'll have to talk about explicitly with people who might have limited or interrupted formal education. Okay. And then I want to spend some time talking about giving feedback. And I think that we all know that praising effort is important, but I also want to stress that it should be authentic and it should be genuine, the praise that you're giving. Sometimes when you over celebrate something that seems simple, it actually is really condescending. Someone does something that is simple and they know that it's simple, even if it's a first for them, and you say, you did it, and you're, overexcited, that feels actually not very good. So consider that treating people with dignity, right, and full respect, genuinely praising effort without going over the top. And then capitalize on opportunities. When you recognize that someone is good at something, give them more opportunities to keep doing that thing that they're good at and use that strength to maybe plug in learning in other areas. And then not all students require the same amount of encouragement. And so some people might really like the consistent praise and excitement. Whereas for me as a learner, when I get that constant praise, then it feels maybe a little bit not so genuine. And I don't like that for me personally. So you can kind of get a sense of that. That's a nice thing about working with small groups of tutoring, is that you can get a better sense of that than you would with a larger class. Okay. This is my last point, and I want to make sure to get through it here, and then we'll go to some questions. But error correction and feedback can be really tricky, and especially when you are a tutor, there are going to be some folks who expect that you are going to correct every single mistake that they make or every single error. But we just talked about the importance of praise, right? And praising the effort. So it's difficult when we have an expectation from this person who's being tutored. And then what we know as tutors, that it's discouraging and not possible to correct every single error and then have learning happen from that. So how do those two things exist in the same space? That's a challenge. So here's my suggestion is when you're giving feedback, have it be intentional. So the types of things that you're going to be correcting and the types of things that you're not going to be correcting ahead of time. If something that someone says leads to you completely not understanding what they said, always correct that. So if comprehension is the problem, then go ahead and correct that and spend some time on that. But if there's a problem with pronunciation, but we're actually just talking about some specific grammar thing, don't correct the pronunciation if we're working on grammar, for example. So I want to talk about explicit and implicit feedback. An example here of explicit feedback, I might say something like, oh, you said he go to school, but go needs ES when you use he. He goes to school. I gave a whole explanation about why what they said wasn't correct. And if we're talking about a third person singular verbs, then this is appropriate feedback for me to give. If this person says he go to school, but they actually meant to say store, I'm not going to say anything about the goes, because that's not what we're practicing, right? Implicit feedback would look like this. Oh, he goes to school. This is what we tend to go for as tutors when we're correcting someone, when we're offering feedback, but it is the least effective way to give feedback, because in no part of this did you actually let them know that there was a mistake. The only thing that you let them know is that you understood them. And it sounds like you just said back to them what they said. They're not going to realize that there was a mistake or an error in there. So it's not going to lead to any kind of change. So if you have a choice here, which you do, between explicit and implicit feedback, go with the explicit feedback where you can, when that's an appropriate level. So for someone who has studied the language a little bit and has some grammar practice, I might do this whole explanation. Oh, you said he go to school, but go needs ES when you're talking about he. Maybe for a beginning language learner, I might say he go to school or he goes to school. Go or goes, and give them the two choices so that they can hear what you said was go. Was that correct? Or is there another option that would be correct? So being really explicit with that and being really direct is going to lead to more learning happening than just recasting what they said in a correct form. Okay. I just breezed through so much information, and I have my contact information. There's breezed through. That's a good phrasal verb and an idiom in one. That's great. But what questions do you have for our last 5 or so minutes?
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you so much. Gosh, I know I have a lot to learn, to be able to do this correctly and be effective. So I really appreciate it. Whew.
Yeah, sorry for the fire hose of information.
No, my brain works pretty
Trying
fast.
to pack it in.
It's good.
Do you have online resources for some of the things we just went through and other like tips you have for teaching? That last thing you said was super helpful, and I definitely was not doing exactly what you said, so that was super helpful for me to fix in the future.
Yeah, I mean, experienced teachers know that recasts are not a helpful way to give feedback, and yet we still do it anyway. Like, it's hard to monitor that and keep yourself from doing it because it's just so intuitive. But yes, I can send you some YouTube videos and things to watch about the differences in types of feedback. And I can send you some example worksheets and things that we use for training ESLC volunteers and this stuff too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You need us to put our email addresses in the chat for you to send that to us?
I can get them from Ermina, and I'll probably actually just send everything to Ermina because I know that there are folks that are not on this call that will want to have some of that information. So I'll send it to her.
Yes.
Nice.
Do you-
Are these slides available also? I feel like it's
Sure.
great.
Yeah, I can send
review.
I can send these slides as well. And then the recording will also be available so you can rewatch different parts as well.